There's a good 400-year gap in the Bible between the last prophet and when Jesus comes on the scene. What was happening then? Some call that period silent, but was God not interacting with his people at all? How do the historical events and cultural shifts from this intertestamental time affect the people groups that we see showing up in the New Testament? And how might it shape the way we view Jesus' followers? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. As many of you know, this is an outgrowth of Theology on Tap, where young adults in Houston come together to drink craft beer and talk about interesting ideas around theology, philosophy, faith, and culture. And again, drink craft beer, which is the real draw. That happens every other month here in Houston. But in between, we record these podcasts for weekly content where we kind of dive deeper. And as many of you know, we've been talking about the Bible probably a quarter of the time. Like once a month, we try to tackle a book of the Bible or weird passages from the Bible or a topic from the Bible. If I'm correct, the last Bible one that would have come out on the podcast was about like prophets. What's a prophet? What are they about? What are they doing? What are those books of the Bible there for? But today we're going to talk about something that's not in at least the Bible that many of us have, which is this in-between time between the last prophet and the New Testament. And joining us to give us his expertise is Dr. Adam Winn. Adam Winn is an associate professor of Christian studies at the University of Mary Hardin, Baylor. He holds a PhD in New Testament from Fuller Theological Seminary. In addition to teaching and writing about the New Testament, he's an avid Houston Astros fan. So you used to live here, but now where do you live?
I've never lived in Houston ever.
Oh, no. I just assumed because of Fuller and because you came, I heard you come speak a couple of years ago, you were here.
No, I've never lived in Houston. I love Houston. I've been an Astros. I grew up in Oregon. I've been an Astros fan since I was 10 years old.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, well, then that means even more then, I guess.
I think so. Yeah. I was like a unicorn in Oregon. Nobody in 1987 in Oregon liked the Astros except for me, I think.
Oh, funny. And of course, I'm joined, as always, by my co-producer, Evan McClanahan, senior pastor at First Lutheran here in Midtown. So, Adam, tell us a little bit about you before we climb into all of the nerdy theological stuff and history. I guess we'll be doing a lot of history today. Tell us just about you, a little bit of your story of faith, and then how you came to be interested in such things.
Yeah, okay. I was raised in the church. Church was always important to my family. Christian faith was always important to my family. I was raised in lower church denominations, evangelical, free, and Baptist. I'm currently identify as Baptist. And it was always important. I would say when I got into high school, it became much more deeply personal to me. And I felt a strong calling in my life to ministry. I didn't know what that looked like when I was in high school. At first, it looked like working with youth and doing student ministry. I went up to college as a biblical studies major. And I think it was in college when I really started to fall in love with the academic side of biblical studies. I spent a semester in Israel. That played a role. And just, through my, my major, diving into critical questions and exploring those more deeply. And I think it was during that time that I really kind of thought, hey, studying this and doing this is a form of ministry. I graduated, I went off, I became a youth pastor. I was a youth pastor for 6 months and realized, oh, I don't want to do this. As
a mom of teenagers, I hear that. I receive that.
I liked aspects of it, but I realized, oh, wait, like working in a church, this just really isn't, I don't know. There were lots of reasons why it didn't fit for me. And so I decided to go back to school, and knowing that I wanted to, or at least having an inkling that I wanted to go on and do some advanced academic work in biblical studies. I went to Fuller Seminary. I did a master's degree there, and I did a PhD there in New Testament. I love it. I can't imagine doing anything else. I'm passionate about studying scripture. I'm passionate about the world of the text. That's probably what I'm most interested in, is where the world of the text meets the text and how that helps us better understand the text. And I see it as an act of service to the church, an act of ministry, an act of worship. I love what I do. I'm passionate about it. And I love doing stuff like this. So excited to be joining y'all today.
Yeah, no, I'm excited too. I heard you speak a few years ago, and you started the talk by asking something like, does anyone know a lot about what was happening in this in between? So today we're going to be talking about what happens in between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. From the last prophet to when Jesus kind of comes on the scene. And you asked something like, who knows what was happening? And very few people raised their hand. And then you said something like, how many Catholics are in the room, or how many Protestants are? I don't know how you worded it, but basically the idea was you don't know about this because you don't have the Catholic Bible that has some of this in the Apocrypha, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But since most of our listeners are not Catholic and maybe don't even know what the Apocrypha is, why don't we start by so this 400 years, was God silent? We call them the silent years. Was he silent?
Yeah. The silent years. The silent years is a term coined by Protestants, right? I mean, likely, right? This because we have this big gap in our Bible that God must not have been saying anything during that time. He must not have been acting in that time. I think that, no, I don't think at all. I think God was active and he's working in his people and working in the story of Israel and all of those sorts of things. I mean, I think, we're privileging Protestantism by calling that a silent 400 years.
Yeah.
And the reality is, I mean, most scholars would say that there are parts of the Old Testament that are actually probably dated to that time period, right? So I think most scholars are going to date the book of Daniel to around 167-ish, right in that area. The time, we'll talk about this later, but the time of the Maccabees and the Maccabean Revolt, the form of Daniel that we currently have is probably crafted to speak to that particular situation. And so
like the events of Daniel happened earlier on, but the writing of it happened later. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, okay. Something like that. That the stories of this figure Daniel are being reappropriated for a time period that Israel is suffering, right? Does that make sense? And the apocalyptic and the visionary sections of Daniel has these dreams and visions, which is an element of it would be called apocalyptic literature. Is very likely crafted to speak to the situation of Jews during this time period. So most scholars would recognize some of the Old Testament is bleeding into pretty significantly into this 400-year time period.
Right.
And then you have a lot of other texts as well, like you mentioned the Apocrypha. You have a large number of Jewish texts that are being written during this time that are religious texts. You have books like Sirach, which is wisdom literature, and Jubilees, and there's just a number of them that show up during this time, which are understood as texts communicating the story of God and the story of Israel, and would be seen by these people as God speaking through these texts in certain ways. I would say no, we don't have a silent. I don't think we have a silent 400 years. I think God is and the history of God's people during that time is incredibly significant, especially for understanding the New Testament.
And so we have writing from then, and we have God interacting with his people, but we don't have like prophets per se coming out and saying, I'm a prophet of the Lord, thus saith the Lord kind of thing until John the Baptist. Maybe.
Well, I'd say this. We don't have a significant number of recorded prophets.
Okay.
I mean, that doesn't mean that's a good question. I mean, that doesn't mean they didn't exist. I think probably you get I don't know. I was thinking about this as you guys sent me these questions and think over these issues. And to be fair, I'm going to just kind of be speaking off the cuff here. So I don't know. I don't know how sound this is, but I'm just thinking about it. You definitely get, after exile, I think you get a really renewed Jewish focus on the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
And the place of the Torah and studying the Torah and devotion to the Torah. I think this gets, significantly more than pre-exile, right? And so part of the prophet's job and role seems to be to call Israel back to Torah. Does that make sense? Part of their role is to say, hey, come back to Torah. And so if they're doing that, and then you have an increased focus on Torah, then perhaps it might make sense that if Israel's doing a better job of being Torah focused, maybe it makes sense you'd have less in the way of prophetic voices calling them back to Torah. They're already doing a good job, so maybe that has something to do with it. The other thing that I think will be pointed out, and this is again different people will view this differently, but most scholars recognize the book of Isaiah to be a book that is that kind of has probably three different authors or phases. So you have what would be called Isaiah that goes all the way up to, I want to say it's chapter, oh gosh, it's right around 39 to 42. It's in there, which would be seen as really dating to, I want to say like the 700s. But then you have a later portion of Isaiah that some might even say dates to that time of that time in between the testaments,
Yeah.
right? And then even later that'd be Deutero-Isaiah, and then later you have third Isaiah, etc. And so those might actually be prophetic voices that are taking on the mantle of Isaiah, but they exist in that time in between. And so while
we actually talked about that in our last podcast. We talked about the breaking up of Isaiah. Yeah.
And where that dates, that could be dating into this post-exilic time period of those 300 years. I'm not an Old Testament scholar, so I don't know exactly where those would be dated, but I think it's possible that some of those prophetic traditions are taking the mantle of a prophet from a previous time period and operating under that mantle.
Sure.
They're still prophetic voices.
I just want to go back to the apocryphal question real fast. People might say if we're not clear on this, they might. It might be we might not be drawing enough distinctions. But basically, a couple of thoughts is that the question of whether the Apocrypha is scripture or not, and therefore I think whether God is speaking through that or not, isn't really related to the time period of it, right? I think the arguments weren't like, for example, it could be that there are scriptural passages written in this 4-century window.
Sure.
And the Apocrypha could have also been written in that time, but that wouldn't be the filter that you would apply to say whether.
That's right.
Right. So there's an authenticity to that, and plus the Apocrypha, it should be said, is written in Greek, whereas all the Old Testament texts were written in Hebrew. I don't know the exact significance of that, but there does seem to be this.
Let me speak to that really quickly, and different. There are going to be apocryphal texts where we have copies of them that probably were, like, I think there's stuff that shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls that wouldn't be in Greek, and what their original language is can be debated, and so there's a textual tradition there. But they show up. I think our primary record of them is going to come from the Septuagint, and yes, those are going to be texts written in Greek. And Daniel's going to have significant portions written in Aramaic, right? And then there's Greek versions of Daniel. So it gets complicated with language. A little bit complicated with language. Just to speak to that. But
yeah, and just because it's in Hebrew doesn't mean it is scripture, and just because it's Greek doesn't mean it isn't.
That's right.
But
language per se isn't a side effect.
Yeah. I just got the impression that was a way people kind of distinguished, from these writings. But and some people might want to point out as well that even the Catholic Church didn't regard the apocryphal writings as canonical until the Council of Trent. So
sure.
If I had a nickel.
If I had a nickel. They would deuterocanonicals, I think, kind of the word that they would use for them, right? They're helpful and useful. That's right. And so Council of Trent, they're in some way responding maybe to the Reformation a bit. And even many Protestant Bibles kept them and had them, I think, until, I just learned this recently from a colleague that's a church historian here, but it showed up significantly up until, and were treated kind of deuterocanonically up until, like, I don't want to say like the 17 or 1800s. And I was on the impression that the Protestants dispensed with them much earlier than that, but perhaps they didn't, from what
they certainly were not in my Bible growing up. So then I went off to seminary, and in my first Old Testament class, they had us doing all these reading about the Maccabees. And I'm like, I've legit never heard of these people. So let's do this.
Sure.
If where we left off was, Malachi is the last book of but the people are in exile. Some were taken by Assyria, some were taken by Babylon. We've got 10 tribes that are sort of lost, but 2 tribes that are kind of holding strong. And so then we are coming into this time. Talk to us about historically what's happening. We have Babylon at that point is kind of the main empire on the scene, would you say? And then they get taken over, and like walk us through kind of what happens historically.
Historically. So when you're still with exile, you're still in the Old Testament, right? You're still Old Testament texts are discussing this time period. So you're in exile in Babylon. Babylon gets taken over by Persia, right? The Persians take over, and it's the Persian king Cyrus the Great that is going to be the one that allows Jews to return to their homeland.
Okay, so that's where we get like Nehemiah, Ezra, these stories.
That's right. Zerubbabel, yeah, all those characters are all connected to return to the land and building the temple again and building the walls of Jerusalem. And that is all under Persian rule, right? They're somewhat like a vassal state, right? They're under Persian rule. It's important to note that a lot of Jews don't come back. A lot of Jews stay. And there is a very prominent Jewish movement or community that exists in Babylon for a long time after this. So not all come back, but some do come back, and they begin to return to cultic sacrifices in the temple and temple worship, and all of that sort of stuff happens during that time. And we get a lot of that actually from the Old Testament. And then what's interesting is we don't have a lot of information. I mean, I think our general understanding is it was relatively peaceful under Persian rule, and things were pretty good, and etc. And then and we don't have a lot of writing about what it was like between Persian rule, like when they get back, when they complete the building of the temple. The temple, they complete the building of the temple, I think, in 515 BC.
Okay.
And then that is a bit of a time period where we don't have a lot of writing from that time period, all the way until about Alexander the Great.
Okay.
Right? Which is, I think, a couple hundred years. Because Alexander, I want to say, is like 323-ish. And so that's a good chunk of time where we really don't have a lot of information. But when where we really start to get Jewish authors writing about what's going on, we really start to get it with the Greeks. And the Greeks are significant because, well, Alexander basically takes over the world in about 10 years, right? I mean, his known world. He takes over the entire Persian Empire, and everywhere he goes, he is taking Greek culture with him. And he's I tell my students, the word we use is Hellenization, right? That he's Hellenizing, and Hellene is the Greek word for Greek. So basically he's just Greeking everything, right? He's just putting Greek on everything, Greek religion, Greek language everywhere. And
Doric columns, Aeolian columns,
right.
Ionic columns,
all the columns.
Yeah, probably all of them. Maybe architecture students are cringing right now. I don't know. Yeah, sure.
Well, they can come on the podcast and correct us.
Yeah, they can do another episode. Refute me later. But
lemon pepper. Okay.
Yeah, so this Hellenization is significant because the Jerusalem and Judea and Galilee are Hellenized, right? I mean, these places, the Jews have returned to their homeland, and that homeland is now Hellenized by Alexander the Great, right? And there's clearly conflict between these two cultures, right? I mean, Greek culture and Jewish culture are very different. Their values are very different. Jews worship one God and not multiple gods. They don't make statues to gods. They circumcise their children, their male children. The Greeks think this is crazy, right? They don't eat pork. Greeks think that's crazy. They don't work on the Sabbath. Greeks think that's lazy, right? So you have all kinds of conflict between these two groups, and that's where I would really say that the Judaism, what's called Second Temple Judaism, which basically goes from the Second Temple all the way to the destruction, the building of the Second Temple to its destruction. That is nothing probably defines Judaism during that time period more than Hellenization, either in resisting it or in accommodating it. But either way, you're being influenced by it, right? And so Hellenization is significant, and you probably have varying Jewish responses. You're gonna probably have some Jews that are willing to accommodate to degrees, right? They're listen, these new people are in town, and you got to learn the language, and you got to try and fit in, and you're going to have some level of accommodation. Probably you have a little more accommodation at the higher, people of a higher social status are going to be more interested in accommodating, because accommodation is going to maintain
beneficial.
It's going to maintain your power and your privilege and your wealth and your property, right? And so if you can, make yourself look more like the people that are in charge, you might be able to maintain connections and all that kind of stuff. But you're also going to have a number of people that are going to significantly resist this, and resist pretty drastically. And you get references now when this group gets its name and when it really is consolidated. You get a group that is referred to as Hasidim, and Hasidim probably originate before the time of the Maccabees. but they are people that are resistant to Hellenization, right? They're pushing back. Now, nobody can avoid it altogether. Nobody's able to just, there's been work done that says all Judaism was in some way Hellenized Judaism. There's varying degrees of it, but every Jew was influenced by Hellenism. It's impossible, but some worked harder than others not to be. And we probably start getting some division between Jews over their willingness to compromise, not compromise, etc. And so that's probably, as you get into the time of Alexander the Great, and then after that, those start to be issues.
And those, what you're describing, those sort of end up breaking down into different, I don't want to say people groups, but sort of like almost like clubs of people that you hear about in the New Testament, right? Like, or maybe not even just in the New Testament, but that you hear about. Like, I remember you talking about the Essenes were maybe the most resistant to Hellenization, and they were responsible for. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting. So we're not quite to a place where we get Essenes yet. Essenes are actually going to be They're going to originate really as a reaction to, well, there certainly could be some idea of Hellenism there, but more a reaction to the way certain Jews, other Hasidim, are understanding their relationship to. Well, so let's
maybe take us back as far as we need to go back. Maybe I've moved us forward too much. Yeah.
And then we're going to get into those because and I think you have in mind probably Pharisees and Sadducees and some of those.
Exactly.
We're not quite there yet. So just to walk you, I'm trying not to, do my best job of walking you through history.
No, I fast forwarded us too much.
Alexander the Great dies, right? He dies. He leaves. He has no heir. Well, he has maybe an unborn son or a son that's just born, but that doesn't work out. His son's not going to do anything, and his generals basically divide his empire up. And so you get two that are particularly important. You get the Seleucus, who's one general, and Ptolemy, who is another general, and one of them takes over basically what is Syria and Babylon and Persia, and the other one takes over Egypt. And these two, and the Ptolemies have control of what we'll call Israel or the Palestine or whatever. They have control at first, but these two groups are going to fight. I believe in a 150-year time period, they fight like 5 major wars. So every 25 years, there's a major war, and where they're fighting is basically going to be in the land of Israel, right? This is where they're fighting. And so that type of experience, I mean, when you have major armies fighting in your homeland, that's going to have consequences. It's going to, people are going to suffer greatly. There's going to be hardship and difficulty. And so you have this kind of, and they're going to be bouncing back. They're under the Ptolemies, but they're going to then fall into the Seleucids, because the Seleucids are going to push down further and take over the territory. And this is going to probably during this time lead to greater divide between the Jews who are willing to accommodate and the Jews who aren't. Likely the ones who are accommodating do better during this time than the ones who don't. And so you start getting strained relationships within Judaism related to Hellenism even more during this difficult and troubling time. And then finally, you get to, we're right around early 160, where would we be? Trying to think through this, about 167 or so. The Jews are under the authority of a Seleucid king called Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. And this is where the Maccabees come into play, right? This is the Maccabees come onto the scene, and basically, what happens? There's kind of a traditional telling of this story, and then there's kind of a more historic, probably a little more historically grounded telling of the story.
Is this the Hanukkah story you're about to tell us?
We'll get to Hanukkah.
I keep fast forwarding. Sorry.
It's kind of what happens. So Antiochus, he wants to basically wipe out the Seleucids. He basically wants to destroy the Seleucids. And he is successful in a military campaign coming down to fight, or not the Seleucids. He is a Seleucid. Sorry, the Ptolemies. He's trying to destroy the Ptolemies. So basically, comes down and the Jews offend him Jewish leadership offends him because they won't let him worship in the temple. He's kind of traveling down and he's worshiping in different temples and offering sacrifices, different gods, kind of God collecting, right? He wants as many gods as he can to be on his side when he goes to fight. The more gods you have, the better, more likely to win. And the Jews said, no, you can't offer sacrifice to our God. And that bothers him, right? He's the king. He should be able to do what he wants. And they also won't give him money from the temple treasury. But he goes down, he fights, and he basically wins. He's successful militarily, but he finds out that Rome is backing the Ptolemies, right? And that if he wants to stay there, that he's going to have to fight Rome. And he knows he can't do this. There's a story, I forget the historian that tells us this. There's a story about him confronting this old Roman ambassador wearing a toga. And basically, he says, good job, you did well. And if you want to stay here, though, you're going to have to fight Rome. And he says, let me go back and talk to my officials about this. And the soldier draws a circle around him, and the ambassador does a circle around him in the dirt and says, no, you have to decide before you leave the circle. She's probably not used to being treated this way, but Rome's pretty powerful. They can kind of do what they want. And so he's angry, right? He's angry. And in the aftermath of this anger, he outlaws Judaism, right? This is kind of the traditional version of the story. Probably his outlawing of Judaism has more to do with already kind of a civil strife in Judea and Samaria and Palestine, in Galilee, between Jews that are not wanting to compromise and Jews that do, right? And so he kind of sides with the ones that are willing to compromise, right? He sides with them, and to aid them, he outlaws Judaism. And this is a really major deal. But the reason we think he's not just opposed to Judaism in general is because it seems like he only outlaws Judaism in Judea and Samaria and Galilee, just in that region. If you're a Jew in Babylon, they don't face the same troubles. That's my understanding. They don't face so this seems like it's politically motivated. Rather than he just hates Judaism, he wants to basically get rid of the problem of division in this part of his world. And so he outlaws Judaism, right? So basically, Jews are forced to accommodate. They're forced to assimilate. Torah scrolls are burned. You're not allowed to circumcise your children anymore. If you circumcise your male children, then you die along with your children. There's people, they force accommodation in eating food that's unkosher, right? Second Maccabees tells stories about these 7 sons that are supposed to eat pork, right? They won't eat it, and they're tortured to death, and they die for not eating it. No Sabbath observance, and they can no longer abstain from pagan worship, or they have to begin to incorporate pagan worship into their lives and all that kind of stuff.
It sounds like the story of Daniel all over again, like, forced worship. And
yes, and that's why the story of Daniel is so important and reappropriated for this time period, right? It's a story that is appropriate, and when Jews are reading it during the time of Antiochus, what's it doing? It's saying, be faithful. And you have that story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? You know that story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's an interesting part in that story where basically they say, we won't do this, and God can deliver us. And even if he doesn't deliver us, it's okay, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the message to the Jews this time who are not accommodating and refuse to compromise, right? And so
interesting.
It speaks to them and says, listen, even if God doesn't deliver you, you don't eat pork. And even if God doesn't deliver you, circumcise your children. And so this becomes this
good message for today too.
Yeah.
I mean, not about pork and circumcision, but about faithfulness. Yeah.
Yeah, about faithfulness. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so this is a really dark and difficult time for Jews. Yeah. This is very well known. I mean, I lived in Israel for a time and studied over there. And this is a significant part of their history that they know very well. And so, this is a very difficult time. They're even and many Jews compromise. I mean, many Jews just say, well, it's not worth it. We will simply become like Greeks. And there are Jewish men that get a surgery called a reverse circumcision so that they will look more like Greeks when they go to the gymnasium.
We've lost Evan. Okay.
Yeah.
And all the men listening, perhaps.
But they will not, the traditionalists will not put up with this for long, and eventually there is a revolt that starts, and they resist. And the story, Second Maccabees tells us this story of a revolt. I think it's Second Maccabees. I might be confusing with first.
Well, we're all Protestant listeners, so no one will even know.
It doesn't matter that much. One of those Maccabees books. And it's a story of a priest, right? This priest, he's an old priest named why am I blanking? Mattathias. That's the priest's name. The priest's name is Mattathias. And he is of the Hasmonean family, right? Hasmonean family. He's a priest, and he acts out violently and kills a Jew who is performing a sacrifice, an unholy sacrifice. And he kills the king's officer who's enforcing the apostasy, right? Kills him. And then calls out the people to say, whoever wants to come with me, we're going out to the wilderness. They go out to the wilderness and they start a resistance movement. And this is the Maccabean Revolt. Mattathias dies shortly after this happens. He's very old. His sons take over. His sons, Judas, his son Simon, and another son, Jonathan, I believe. And there might be another son, I can't remember. Those are the three that are coming to me. But Judas is given the nickname Maccabeus, right? And I believe the understanding is Maccabeus refers to something like a hammer, right? A hammer that is smashes the Seleucid forces. And so Maccabeus the Maccabeans and Maccabeus is all associated with this nickname that is given to this Jewish, basically becomes the leader of the Jewish rebels, and has significant success against the Seleucids. He's kind of regarded as a military genius in the way he's able to defeat these Greek fighting forces. He has a number of successes. He takes back Jerusalem, and this is where we get to Hanukkah, right? Okay. This is where Hanukkah comes in. He takes over Jerusalem. The temple. Oh, I didn't even mention this. Antiochus Epiphanes, I believe, puts a statue of Zeus in I think it's the statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies. And most
that is contraindicated in the Torah.
Yeah, that's not okay, right? This is the problem, and this is likely. Most scholars think that when Daniel, the visionary text of Daniel, refer to an abomination that causes desolation, it's referring to this event, right? The statue of Zeus being put up in the Holy of Holies. So Judas Maccabeus, he takes over, he takes Jerusalem back over again. He cleanses the temple and purifies the temple and removes all the pagan elements from the temple. And this is where Hanukkah comes in. This is the story where there's not enough oil, right? There's not enough oil to light lamps. And the oil miraculously lasts. And so this is the celebration of Hanukkah. And a festival that Jews are going to celebrate every year from then on out.
And you did a way better job than Adam Sandler of telling the story, so I appreciate that. Yeah.
Would you like me to sing the Hanukkah song?
I actually would love if you.
But you made a lot less money
than Adam Sandler. That's true. No, I'm gonna pass.
Okay, fair enough.
But it is pretty funny. Well, I'm glad I did a better job than
Can I jump in with random questions? We can come back to the historical path of the letter, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on the Magi. You mentioned Daniel, right? Like, okay, there are a lot of Jews who remained. By the way, there are a lot of Jews who remained in the exile, but there are a lot of Jews who didn't go in the first place. Yeah. So I think when the Jews who returned, there was a lot of conflict there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Sure. Ezra and Nehemiah talk about that conflict.
And so we always just kind of think of, and this is true in our race relation conversations today. Like everyone's just like all white people the same, all black people the same, all Jewish people the same. It's like
monolithic.
That just isn't the story of history at all. But anyway,
sure.
But there are a lot of Jews that stayed behind, and the word Magi is in Daniel. And so there is a theory that the Magi coming from the east and at the birth of Christ, were highly trained, essentially astrologers. Do you have, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, if you think that's like a legit theory, or if the whole thing maybe is just legendary, or if you think there really could have been people who, knew how to read stars in a way and actually read the texts in a way. Just a thought.
It's a great question. That's entirely possible. Entirely possible. I don't know. The difficult thing is we just have so little evidence to go on. But making those type of connections between magi that come from the east that are interested in a future king of Israel, certainly, and that you have a group of Jews that are back in and maybe even some that have positions of importance and power and that kind of thing. Like, it seems entirely plausible that is that the story could grow out of that, right? Historically verifying it's another really hard thing to do, right? So I'd say, I mean, certainly that's
okay. I'm just looking for my crackpot theories to be possible. That's
well, what's crackpot about it? I'm sorry, like
nothing. No, I actually think it's pretty legit.
I do too. I mean, that's always been my understanding, right? There's an exilic connection.
Yeah, it's plausible. You will have some scholars who will say, "Oh, this is like you. I forget how you phrased it.
He said legendary.
Legendary.
I logged it away because I was surprised.
And you'll certainly listen. That's certainly going to be a position that some scholars are going to hold. This is a legendary story, but there's no reason what you're suggesting is not possible, right? I think it's totally possible. And certainly it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to think about and why would people come from the east? Your connection to a Jewish community there that would be interested in these things
and it's not just about like the stars. It's also about like in Daniel, the 70 weeks and all of that, which is why, there was a messianic expectation around the time of Jesus, and how people interpreted those weeks. But, but that's absolutely okay. That's, but let me ask this as well. So the temple is rebuilt, but my understanding is that, God was in the Holy of Holies. God was with the people in the tabernacle and then in the temple. There wasn't a question of God's presence. In fact, God is so present that the Philistines have to bring the Ark of the Covenant back, right? Because of the tumors and all this kind of weird stuff. They're like, here, take it back. We thought we wanted it, but we changed our mind. Like, your God is too much for us. But after the destruction of the first temple and the return, what I have heard is that there was a common assumption that God did not return to the temple, that God was not present in the same way. Do you have any thoughts on that? So what kind of happened was there was like a culture of Torah observance and Torah following and like stricter, well, I guess with the ones who weren't compromising with the Greeks, but there was more of a focus on the word, I guess, rather than the presence of God in some way.
Interesting.
Is that accurate, or what do you think?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I mean, I've never heard of the sense that Jews didn't believe that God resided in the temple, right? I mean, that he didn't reside. I don't know. I'd love to see the sources or indication that in the second temple, God didn't reside there in the same way he did in the first.
Is the question maybe there's not a text like when Solomon dedicates the temple and you have the Shekinah glory and the moment sort of, that there's not another moment like that, at least described in the text? Is that kind of where that comes from?
It may be. My sense is that the temple theology temple theology of the second temple was similar, was similar to the previous, right? That God resided there in a unique way. That again, that reality had been reestablished. The way they do sacrifice there, the way they worship there, all of that suggests to me that that's what's going on there. To be honest, I've not heard somebody make that case before, so I'm like, I've never heard that before. That's never been my impression. That's never been my understanding. So my cautious response would be, I don't think so. Now, you're absolutely right, Evan, on a greater emphasis on Torah study and the synagogues and Torah being studied in the synagogues. But I don't. So while that piece is much more prominent in Judaism during this time, but I think it comes alongside of temple worship and articulates temple worship. I don't have the sense that Jews would have felt that. I mean, ancient temples symbolize or communicated the presence of the God, right? For pagans and for Jews. And so I'm pretty confident that Jews would have believed that their God, again, their God dwelt there. I mean, I think one argument for this could be what you see in the book of Acts with Stephen, right? The story of Stephen, who basically argues that God's not dwelling in the temple anymore. And they basically kill him for this, right?
Mhm.
And so that would lead me to believe that the people that are killing him, they believe God resides in that temple.
And I wonder, the curtain being torn, in the temple from top to bottom would, I mean, that's a text about God leaving, right?
Yeah.
Or just taking away the barrier between.
Yeah, barrier, God leaving, potential foreshadowing of its destruction. All of those sorts of things are probably fixed into there. Yeah, I definitely think that. Yeah, I definitely think Christians. One of the Christian responses to the destruction of the temple by the Romans is to say, "Well, God doesn't live there anymore."
Yeah.
So Rome didn't destroy God's house. Rome destroyed. Rome was a pawn of the Jesus the Messiah, and that kind of thinking I think is very prevalent. So yeah, but I do so yeah, I would say yeah, I'm pretty convinced.
Yeah, no,
it's an interesting thought experiment.
And
to hear you guys talk about
I would be open to reading sources that suggested a qualitative difference of God's presence. I'm open to that. I'm just not aware of it.
Yeah. Before we get back to where we are in history that filters down into Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, all zealots, all that, we do have a question that came in on Facebook that says, do you, Adam, know what it was about Israel that made so many people across millennia want to be there? Like, what is it about that area? Land? Yeah. I mean, milk and honey sound amazing, but I mean, is that?
Yeah, but it turns out to be not nearly as fertile land as, say, right around the Nile or certain parts of Persia, right? So yeah. I mean,
if you don't have anything at the ready, that's fine.
Jews want to be. I mean, it's again. I'm going to say that it's as far as the complicated history over the last 2,000 years, I'm not the one to speak to that. But obviously, I mean, the Jews want to return there because of the promises, right? I mean, because of the promises to Abraham, because this land was promised to them by God. And I'm going to say that's going to be the powerful motivator for Jews to be in that land. Certainly throughout the last 2,000 years.
I think the question came in when you were talking about Ptolemy and Seleucids and all of the wars that were happening. Yeah. And so they were like, why this little tiny area of land being involved in that to begin with, kind of?
Okay. Well, that's great. That is just geography, right? I mean, basically all that is geography, because that little narrow strip of land is what is connecting. Basically, that's what's connecting the northern Syria, Persia, to Egypt. That's the only way you go. If you go further east than that, you're in the desert, right?
Okay.
And you don't, that would not, you don't want to march your armies through the desert. If you can march them through this nice little this nice little land here where you can confiscate people's food and that's where you want to be.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to do with the Greeks loving the land of Israel or wanting to be there. It just has to do with it's convenient.
This is advantageous. Yeah.
I thought it was the exfoliating salts from the Dead Sea.
Yeah, the Dead Sea scrubs.
They're worth a lot of money.
They're epic. Okay, so let's get back on to. So we've got the Maccabean Revolt.
Yeah.
And then the story of the 8 crazy nights. I guess I shouldn't say that. And then take us forward from there. Like what? So we've got.
Yeah. So
who's in charge at that point? Sort of Persia? No, where are we in the?
Okay, so we're
obviously Greece. Yeah.
Yeah, the Greek. I mean, Seleucids, Ptolemies are Greeks, right? They're Greeks. So they're an expression of Hellenization. And so so you have significant success under Judas Maccabeus, taking back Jerusalem, and then I can't remember exactly when he dies. I know that the Maccabees get the support of Rome in 160. Right. And so that gives them that doesn't mean the Seleucids are ready to relent and let them be who they are, but it kind of gives a political justification to the Maccabean leadership, Judas, his brothers, and they become the leaders of the people since the time he takes over through that time. And then so you reach kind of this when you get Rome's support, that helps you a lot, right?
So I hear.
At least their backing is helpful. But then there's a historian named Josephus that is really helpful for all this history. And man, I just was reading through this again recently and was just struck by how tumultuous the time after the Maccabean Revolt is, and all of the political intrigue and alignments with this particular group against the Seleucids, and then the Seleucids kidnapping this brother of the Maccabees, and then trying to get them to do certain things, and then them killing the brother, and just all kinds of really dramatic things are happening during this time as the Jews are trying to grapple and fight for some level of independence. And they do eventually reach a level of independence, and I'm forgetting the exact date. I want to say, because there's a lot of fighting with the Seleucids to achieve this, and a lot of political drama that's going on. But eventually they do, the Maccabees, or the Hasmoneans, right? The Maccabees, family name is Hasmonean. They achieve a level of independence where they are not fighting with the Seleucids as much. And eventually Rome's going to take over where the Seleucids are. And so Seleucids aren't as big of a problem anymore. And they kind of have a level of independence, right? But this is not a glorious time of, Jews are looking forward to and anticipating, based on the prophets, this kind of God restoring Israel, God raising up a deliverer, God making them great again, God bringing a time of peace and prosperity. This is not that time, right? I mean, it's chaotic in a lot of ways. It's unstable in a lot of ways. It's not marked by great prosperity. It's marked by kind of interaction with kind of Roman rulers in the area, or Roman figures, and fighting with each other. And it's really chaotic. And it's also marked as you move further and further away from Judas and his brother Simon, who are early leaders, and then their sons. As you get further and further away from them, you begin to get, let's just say, their leadership wasn't as strong, right? You're still being governed by the same family. But there's this perception of corruption, and by the way, so basically the Maccabees and all those who are a part of the revolt would identify probably as the Hasidim, right? These are the ones who won't compromise, right? But then after they kind of establish themselves as the leaders of Jews in that area, the Hasidim themselves start to fragment. Right? They start to divide over things, and this is where you get an emergence of a group like the Essenes. The Essenes begin to develop during this time, and the Essenes are responding to what they perceive as a corrupt priesthood, who is running the temple, and a corrupt religion, and this movement that says, listen, and you have different expressions of Essenes. You have some extreme versions and less extreme versions of Essenes, but essentially they view the Jewish faith as corrupt. Their leadership is corrupt, and so they want to just separate, right? They want to separate themselves from this group. Some might still live in and around villages, but they're not interacting. They want to do their own thing. And then some go off and start wilderness communities where they completely separate. So very likely, I think the dominant view is that the Qumran community that created the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, most people think they created that they're they're the ones who owned and produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're an Essene community, right? And they're completely separated from society. They live by very strict rules. They're a sect of Judaism that emerges during the time of the Hasmoneans. The Pharisees, their origins are a little unclear. Some would say that maybe the Pharisees existed before the Hasmoneans, but I think most people see them as a group that is really galvanized during the Hasmonean period. And they, again, have their own religious perspectives on a number of things. And then the Sadducees also seem to emerge during this time. Sadducees are, again, their origins are a bit unclear. Some argue that they are basically the party of the Hasmoneans, right? That they kind of are this group that grows the religious expression of the priestly Hasmoneans. But others say, no, they're in opposition to the Hasmoneans, and they grow, and we don't. It's hard to say. The only thing we have about the Sadducees, we have nothing written by the Sadducees themselves. The only thing we have about the Sadducees are what their opponents said about them, which is never a fair way to really reconstruct any group. But we probably know something about them from what they say, but we have to kind of take it with a grain of salt. And so these groups, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Pharisees, really are the Hasidim fragmented and galvanizing around certain things and certain teachings and certain groups. And that happens all during that time, right? They all emerge during the this Hasmonean period that is going to be somewhere between, like, I want to say, like 135-ish to 63 BC, kind of where we're
at. Would this also be where we get like the Zealots? I remember you talking about later we hear like Simon the Zealot. Who are the Zealots?
Yeah. Okay. So Josephus, the historian Josephus, talks about there being three major philosophies in and maybe groups or sects that you might have, and he names the Essenes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, and then he says, and there was a fourth philosophy, and the fourth philosophy possibly drew from multiple. Does that make sense? You might have had people that were Pharisees that also kind of subscribed to the fourth philosophy. Okay. And that philosophy would have been a philosophy that is connected with this idea of being a zealot, right? That believe in that God's promises are going to be fulfilled through violent action of Jews themselves, right? That they are going to, that they're, what would we say? Them stepping out.
They're like the instruments of God.
They're foreign oppressors, right? That's God will then come alongside them and aid them, and it will be their act of. And you can kind of see this from the Old Testament, right? Like when Israel is faithful and steps out, even though they're small in number, what happens? God steps in and helps them, and that probably has something to do with the Zealots are probably looking at those traditions, right? The traditions of Jonathan going to battle with his armor bearer, or Joshua, these stories, and that is kind of that's how God's going to work. There is not an official zealot party until you get to the Roman, the Jewish revolt against Rome around 66, and then it seems like you have a party that is identified as the Zealots. But you have people subscribing to the fourth philosophy long before that. And so when it talks about Jesus having a follower that's a zealot, what that probably means is he's not a card-carrying member of the zealot party, right? But he is a subscriber to the philosophy that we need to do something about Rome and we need to act out violently to take Rome down. As unbelievable as that may seem, we need to do it. And so that's probably what we're talking about as far as the Zealots go. That philosophy probably doesn't start as early as the other ones. Rome, it really probably begins, the earliest it's going to begin is when Rome basically takes over. And in 63, the Roman general Pompey is going to, he's on an expedition in the east, taking over small kingdoms in the east and Syria, etc. And he basically marches his armies into, takes over Jerusalem, right? And this effectively ends any type of Jewish independence. The Hasmoneans, that is ended with Pompey coming in and appointing, essentially establishing Roman rule in the area. All right, everyone. It looks like the internet has gone out and they're having a really hard time figuring it out. And they said, maybe I could just give some closing comments here. So happy to do that while I'm recording right now. I think we left off with Rome essentially taking over, right? Rome taking over and ending Jewish independence. And it is from this kind of takeover eventually, and it might not be until 6 AD that you get this kind of zealot movement growing out of that. But Rome takes over. Rome is not going to be in direct control. Rome takes over, and Rome is going to institute what is known as client kings. That's where Rome selects a figure from the region, somebody familiar with the territory and has connections and has power and wealth in and of themselves, and puts them in charge. And the client king that most people are going to be familiar with is going to be Herod the Great. Herod the Great is going to rule for a long time in the region of what we call modern day Israel, and have power backed by Rome. Herod is going to actually be somebody who beautifies most of the region. Herod the Great is going to be known for basically building the city of Caesarea, completely remodeling the Jewish temple, making it the initial temple that's built after return from exile is pretty shoddy, and he transforms it. Takes decades to finish it, but it's beautiful. He's not going to be well liked. He's incredibly paranoid. But anyway, he ushers in basically Roman rule in the area, but not direct Roman rule, right? And so while Jews don't like him very much, they like him a lot more than they would like being a direct Roman province and being under direct Roman authority. Herod is going to die. He's going to divide up his kingdom, his client kingdom, between three sons of his. Herod Antipas in the north, Philip also in the north, and then his son Herod Archelaus is going to take over Samaria and Judea. His son Herod Archelaus is going to last for about 10 years, but the people dislike him so much that Rome's going to remove him. And that is when Rome institutes direct Roman rule in Judea and in Samaria. And Rome is going to put Roman governors in there. And then Judea and Samaria are going to be directly taxed by Rome. Before, they'd be taxed by the client king that was there, and that client king would give allegiance to and support to, and I believe even money to Rome, but it wasn't direct, and now it's direct, and this is probably where you really get a zealot movement growing out of this. Don't know exactly how far they want me to go here, but this rule of Roman governors and client kings takes us up to the time of Jesus. Jesus is going to be, when he's in Galilee, under the rule of Herod Antipas, a son of Herod the Great. When he is ever in Jerusalem, he's going to be under the power of a Roman governor, right? He's going to be under Pontius Pilate as the Roman governor when he's an adult, and operating under that world. And so Judaism during this time, during the time of what Protestants often refer to as the silent years, is going to progress through a number of different people in charge, right? You start with the Persians, and then Alexander the Great takes over. And then you have the Ptolemies and the Seleucids fighting over this area. So you have the Seleucids and you have the Ptolemies. Eventually, the Ptolemies start in control, and the Seleucids take over. Seleucids finally control the area. That's when you have Antiochus Epiphanes outlining Judaism that I talked about, and Jews then rebelling against that. That ushers you into eventually a time of Jewish independence where the Hasmoneans are ruling. The Hasmonean period ends with Rome, and Rome takes over, and that brings you all the way up to the time of Jesus. And what's happening during this time, and the Jewish groups that are developed, right? The sects of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, and the development of the Zealot philosophy, all of that is shaping the Judaism of Jesus. And there's a number of things, Jewish texts that are written during this time, Jewish development on Jewish messianic hope during this time, Jewish reading of the scriptures going from Hebrew into Greek, translating into Greek, the Septuagint, all kinds of significant developments are happening during these years. That is shaping the Judaism that Jesus is going to be birthed into, the Judaism that he's going to be interacting with, the Judaism of his contemporaries. In the Gospels, Jesus interacts with Pharisees. He interacts with Essenes. No, he doesn't interact with Essenes, although John the Baptist might be connected to Essenes in some way, and the Sadducees, etc., the priestly class, all of this sort of stuff. So understanding this time period is incredibly important for understanding the time of the New Testament and shaping that time period. Perhaps maybe we'll connect with them again, and maybe they can ask some more specific questions. I'm just trying to wrap up where we were headed. I think where we were headed, and maybe this could be added on to what we already discussed. But I think that brings us to a good stopping point. It marches us through the political history, what Jews were experiencing, and an important part of the story of Israel, an important part of the story of God's people, that moves you into the story of those people as you get into the New Testament. You don't just have a time of insignificance after the Old Testament ends. You have tremendously significant events taking place that are shaping Judaism. Hellenism, not the least of those, but the greatest of those. So hopefully this was helpful for you. Hopefully understanding this time a little better was helpful for you. And hopefully through reconnecting with Sarah and Evan, maybe we can ask questions about this, or I can get questions from you. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. I hope this time was profitable. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'm going to sign off. Take care.